Suffering is one of life's most profound mysteries. It raises questions that echo through every heart. Why do we suffer? Is there meaning in our pain? Can anything good come from our deepest wounds? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are essential to our journey. Often, when we are in the middle of suffering, it feels like we are completely alone. The weight of our burdens can isolate us, pulling us away from others and even from ourselves. But there is something paradoxical about suffering. It can also awaken us. It can stir something deep within us that no amount of comfort ever could. It exposes the illusion of control and forces us to confront what truly matters. In those moments of raw honesty, when the noise of life fades and we are left with nothing but ourselves and our pain, we begin to see with different eyes. Suffering strips away the superficial and demands that we search for something more enduring, something more eternal. In that search we begin to discover meaning, not in spite of suffering, but often because of it. There's a quiet truth that suffering reveals. It makes us real. Not in the polished, surface-level way the world defines success or happiness, but in a way that strips us down to our most honest and authentic selves. When we suffer, the masks we wear fall off. We no longer have the energy to pretend, to impress, or to control the narrative. What remains is raw humanity, wounded, questioning, but honest, and in that honesty there is beauty. For the first time, we begin to understand others who suffer too. Pain expands our capacity for empathy. Suddenly, we are able to sit with others in their sorrow, not trying to fix it, but simply being present. That presence is healing. Suffering does not always teach us answers, but it teaches us presence. It teaches us how to love more deeply, how to walk with compassion, and how to carry one another's burdens. In that way, pain becomes a teacher. It shows us who we are when everything else is stripped away. And surprisingly, what we find in those stripped-down moments is not weakness, but strength. The kind of strength that comes from walking through the fire and still standing. When we are suffering, it's easy to believe that we are stuck, that the pain we're in now will never end. But suffering is not the end of the story. It is part of the journey, and often it is the part that prepares us for the next chapter. Pain has a strange way of sharpening our vision. It reveals things we couldn't see before, our dependence, our limits, and ultimately, our need for something greater than ourselves. It pushes us to ask bigger questions, to look beyond temporary comforts and toward enduring hope. In this way, suffering does not destroy us. It redefines us. It teaches us how to live more purposefully, more awake, and more aware of the sacredness of each moment. Often, we only begin to seek truth when we are desperate for meaning, and suffering gives us that desperation. It presses us to go deeper, to stretch our souls, and to find something worth holding on to when everything else fades. That search, painful as it may be, is where purpose begins. Not after the suffering, but within it. In times of suffering, silence can feel overwhelming. We cry out, we plead, and sometimes we're met with what feels like stillness. No answers, no relief, just silence. It can make us feel abandoned, as if no one hears or cares. But what if silence isn't absence? What if silence is space, sacred space, for something deeper to grow? In stillness we are forced to listen in new ways, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. That silence can become a sanctuary, a hidden place where our character is refined and our faith is tested. It's in those quiet places that transformation begins. It's where we learn to sit with our questions instead of rushing to fix them. It's where endurance is born, and over time, what once felt like an empty silence begins to sound like the whisper of grace. A whisper that says, you are not alone. Even in this, you are being shaped. Suffering doesn't always come with loud revelations. Sometimes it comes with quiet forming, a slow, deliberate shaping of the soul. And in that silence we learn that the deepest truths are not shouted, they are whispered. No one asks for suffering, and yet, when we look back, it is often the seasons of hardship that taught us the most. Not just about the world, but about ourselves. Suffering has a way of forcing reflection. It brings hidden wounds to the surface, confronts us with our fears, and exposes the beliefs we've built our lives on. Sometimes those beliefs need to be challenged. Sometimes we discover we've placed our identity in things that cannot hold the weight of life. Success, approval, comfort, pain shakes those foundations. But it doesn't do so to destroy us. It does so to rebuild us, to show us a more solid ground to stand on, to remind us that who we are is not determined by our circumstances, but by how we respond to them. Suffering then becomes a kind of mirror. It reveals our true self, not the image we present to the world, but the one that endures when everything else is stripped away. And what we find in that reflection is not just brokenness, but a soul being refined by fire. Sometimes suffering introduces us to the very things we tried to avoid: vulnerability, dependence, and surrender. These are not comfortable concepts in a world that praises independence and control. But suffering reveals how fragile we truly are, and in that fragility, something unexpected can happen. We begin to grow. We begin to see that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the doorway to connection. We begin to understand that we were never meant to carry everything alone. Pain brings us to the edge of ourselves, and that's where surrender becomes possible. Not a surrender that says, "I give up," but one that says, "I can't do this without help." That kind of surrender softens us. It opens us to receive, not just from others, but from grace. It teaches us humility and trust, and it frees us from the exhausting burden of trying to manage everything. In this way, suffering becomes a humbling teacher. It doesn't just expose our limits, it invites us to accept them, and in doing so it makes space for something greater to fill us: compassion, courage, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing we are not alone. As we walk through pain, time seems to stretch. Moments feel longer, days heavier, and waiting becomes its own kind of suffering. But within that waiting, something is forming. Suffering slows us down. It interrupts our rush, disrupts our routines, and forces us to pay attention. In that space, we begin to notice things we'd overlooked: the way a kind word soothes a tired heart, the light filtering through trees, the importance of simply breathing. Suffering has a way of awakening us to the present. It strips away distractions and reveals what's essential. That clarity, though painful, is a gift. It teaches us to live more deeply and love more intentionally. Even as we long for the suffering to end, we begin to see that something sacred is happening in the process. We are being shaped, not in loud, dramatic ways, but in quiet, steady transformation. Each day becomes a step toward healing, and over time what once felt like aimless waiting turns into patient becoming. Suffering teaches us that growth is not always fast, but it is always possible. Pain often asks us to let go. We cling to expectations, dreams, people, and versions of ourselves that once made sense. But suffering comes, and suddenly those things no longer hold. The loss is real, it cuts deep. Letting go can feel like a small death, but it's also the beginning of rebirth. In releasing what we can't keep, we make room for what we never imagined. Sometimes we have to lose what we thought we needed to discover what truly sustains us. That discovery doesn't happen overnight. It takes courage to release and trust. But each time we do, we grow lighter. We become more free. Pain invites us to loosen our grip, to open our hands and hearts to a greater story, a story not